Hello, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us for what is our first panel discussion for the Dallas Opera's new series, TDO Connections. Just a bit of history about this series. The purpose of this series is for us as the Dallas Opera to tell stories in a more human-centered approach and to ensure that we are providing opportunity for ourselves and for our audiences, for our communities to explore the many different themes and the many different connections that come with opera. Today, our discussion will focus on representation in opera, which means so many things. We'll cover those things with our wonderful guests here. But of course, in good Dallas Opera practice, I will start this particular conversation with a land and people acknowledgement. I do want to take the time right here, right now in this space to acknowledge that we in Dallas are on stolen land. We are on the land of the Caddo, the Wichita, and the Comanche Sovereign Nations. Nations of human beings who lived the full human experience, who loved, who lost, who fought, who cultivated the land since time immemorial. Nations who also faced horrible conditions that include genocide and policy that allowed for forceful removal by any means necessary. I also want to take this time to acknowledge that people were stolen from their homes off the coast of Africa and brought here to what is now Dallas and forced into free and enslaved labor. From that stolen enslaved labor, we now have what we enjoy as Dallas. Dallas is not alone in this, as the entire nation does benefit from stolen land and stolen labor. Of course, these are things that none of us created. These are all conditions that we've inherited. But with this inheritance also comes the opportunity to connect, to heal, and to make sure that we move forward in truth-telling and in sharing these narratives and in connecting as one another and as our communities going forward. So I do take this time to thank you for joining us for this land and people acknowledgement. And with this, I'll introduce myself, of course. My name is Quodicia DeVay Johnson. I'm the Education and Company Culture Manager for the Dallas Opera. I will be your moderator for this amazing discussion. We'll do something different today. As our guests introduce themselves, I will also have them answer a very poignant question that we have in opera, especially for this conversation. I will begin with Stephanie. Stephanie, can you tell us a bit about yourself? And as you tell us about yourself, can you also share a time when you felt that your identity, your culture, who you are as a person was properly and respectfully represented in performing arts, in opera, anytime on the stage?
I'll go ahead and answer your question first because I think it speaks to my identity and the uniqueness of it. So the first time I felt respectfully represented in a live performance, I have not had that experience with opera, so I'm going to share as a musical theater nerd. Seeing the 25th annual Putnam County Spelling Bee was the first time I saw myself and felt a connection to a character in a live performance. And it was the character of Marcy Park, who sings a song called I Speak 6 Languages. And it's a song about how, of course, she's one of the smartest students in the classroom and expected to win the spelling bee, but she is also All-American in hockey and can play Mozart, but likes the theme of Rocky more. And it was also originated by Deborah S. Craig on Broadway, who's a Korean adoptee like myself. So to see a character that was not only Korean American, played by an adoptee like myself, but allowed to have this multifaceted identity that was not stereotypical, expanded my vision of what I could be and the things that I was allowed to believe about myself and achieve.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Stephanie joins us as a staff member of Dallas Truth Racial Healing and Transformation. I will now extend that same question to Suli. Can you let us know who you are? And then let us know a time that you felt that your identity, your culture, who you are as a person was respectfully represented on stage.
Hi, everyone. My name is Suli Nidio, and I'm an Afrolatinx soprano, part of the Black Opera Alliance Leadership Council, and I also started a project called the Afrolatinx Song and Opera Project, where we commission works that tell the stories of the Afrolatinx community in the US and create performance opportunities for that community and those of the African diaspora. Um, one of the times, so something that I think that never gets highlighted in opera is one of my biggest inspirations that kind of opened my mind to being an opera singer was Martina Arroyo. She is one of the most well-known opera singers, a beautiful Black woman, and she's also Afro-Latina because she's Black and Puerto Rican. And that's something that's never really talked about. But once I realized that there was someone with a similar identity doing this or in a similar lineage, I was like, oh, this is also an option for me too. And that was super important to see someone that I was like, oh wow, I look like her, or I can look like her, and oh, she's Puerto Rican, and oh, I'm Dominican. That was super exciting for me as an undergrad to see. So before that, it felt there was like a distance between me and opera. I liked it, but I wasn't sure. And so just to see that was really amazing, and to see how far she went with her career and all the things that she did with her program, it was really inspiring.
Thank you for sharing. And of course, we have Nick. Nick, can you let us know who you are, right? What would you like everybody to know about you in this space? And the time that you felt that you were respectfully and authentically, right, represented.
Sure. My name is Nick Pon, and I am a tenor based in San Francisco. I am also a co-founder and artistic director of an organization called Collaborative Arts Institute of Chicago, which is devoted to the art of song and based in Chicago, like in the name. I am originally from Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where I grew up, and my heritage is Greek American and Chinese American, and I have to say, actually, the first time I'm going to address this sort of from the perspective of a performer. The first time I've actually encountered repertoire that I felt represented me and my identity was January of 2020. I had the privilege of doing the world premiere of a new song cycle for string quartet and tenor called Stranger by Nico Muhly. And the piece is built up around writings that relate to immigration in the United States. And he basically took accounts from people who came through Ellis Island and juxtaposed those with accounts relating to Chinese exclusion. And in particular, the texts relating to Chinese exclusion policies of the late 19th century and early 20th century. That is the first time I really felt like I saw myself in a piece of classical music. It was an extraordinarily powerful experience getting to perform it and premiere it. And I've since recorded it, so it's going to come out soon. But yeah, coming into an art form that I love so much, and that, classical music and opera in general, I grew up playing the violin. Both of those things are the things that made me feel like I had a place of belonging and gave me community. But I don't think I ever really saw myself in them. I've always felt like I've been coming at it from the place of an outsider because it's such a Eurocentric art form that's really dominated by white stories and white experience.
Right.
So this recent experience of doing this new piece just over a year ago for the first time has kind of been life-changing, actually. So I'm in the midst of a moment.
If you do not mind sharing, how long have you been a performer? For this to be your first time having that feeling, having that experience of January 2020, compared to how long?
Yeah, compared to, I made my professional debut in 2002. So it's 2 decades in, basically.
Yeah, 2 decades in.
Yeah.
And Nick joins us, as he said, with his organization, but also as a representative of the Asian Opera Alliance. So we have such amazing experience and such amazing individuals in the space for today's conversation. Yes, we will talk about representation in opera, but we'll come at it from different angles, of course, what that means for communities, what that means for performers, what that means for staff, for audience members, what that means as we start to tell the stories of others and our own stories. How do we find a space that is meaningful, and how do we find a space that allows opera to move forward? We will not be holding back for today's conversation. So just so everybody knows, it's just natural. That's what comes into space. So I'm going to kick it off with a question for Stephanie first. Stephanie, of course, you're joining us as an artist yourself and as communications director of Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation. This is important, of course. Can you share about the intersections of art and racial and ethnic identities as yourself as an artist, but then also in your work?
Yeah, and my work, it's in our name, Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, but the TRHT framework was designed to eradicate and jettison this belief in a false hierarchy of human value. So the myth that there's a set of values that are placed on people based on the color of their skin, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their sexuality, etc. And so all of our work is to tell the truth about how that has been baked into every institution, every policy in our country, especially globally, and that does not exclude the arts. So the arts is an institution, it is a structure, it is a system. And in the same ways that we see people being valued and people's cultures and races being valued at different levels on this hierarchy, we see that in the arts. And it is embedded in every aspect of the arts. So it is who is writing the works that we're seeing, who is producing, directing, designing costumes, who is cast, who is in the audience, who has access to consume and to experience the art. And so until we start telling the truth and start healing from the real ramifications and harms that have happened in every industry, including the arts, we can't get to that point of transformation and really being equitable in our policies and practices. And so the work I do is because I grew up in the arts and didn't see myself reflected, did not see a future on Broadway, did not see myself, in Miss Saigon and performing in roles like that for the rest of my life, and realized, that was a problem. And so I kind of veered off in this direction. And I'm really honored that I get to tap back into my first love and tie it back to what I'm doing today.
Absolutely. So in this, and feel free to jump in the conversation, of course, everyone. We are seeing that the arts are not exempt. And I wanted to touch on this first and foremost, because a lot of times there are assumptions that because it's the art, because we all love each other, because we all love the arts, we're all family, it's all good, we have those good feelings, that we do not face the very same things that go on outside of our opera houses, that go on outside of our pits, that go on outside of our stages. This is a very dangerous approach to reality, because in reality, those very same structures that got us to the stage are the very same things that happen on the stage, and the very same things that we are therefore reiterating and sharing with others when we ask them to come and watch these things, come and watch what we're doing. I'll stop talking. Go ahead. Who else would like to? Suli, go for it.
In that same vein, I mean, it's almost as if being an artist and being part of the arts, it's seen as something that transcends the issues that exist within our society, within our structures, as if those structures aren't affecting the structures within the arts. And it's just, it doesn't make any sense to kind of see it that way. You can't isolate this one thing and make it seem like it's not going to be affected. Like this art exists within a context, historically and presently. So it's going to always reflect the systems, it's always going to reflect the time, it's always going to reflect the psyche of the population as a whole of whatever time that it's being created. So yeah, I've noticed that. It's like, oh, I'm an artist, therefore, I don't see those issues, or I don't perpetuate those things. Yeah, well, we got to re-examine at that point and become a little more self-aware and just aware of the systems and of the spaces and how are they functioning. And at that point, it's like the most marginalized person with the most marginalized identities intersectionally, when they're thriving is when everything is cool.
I feel like everybody has expressed that all beautifully. All I can add is amen and 100%.
So as we continue to look at what it means for us to be aware that the social constructs that kind of define and direct what we are doing also influence the arts in such real ways, I'm going to ask Zuli, you often talk about your experiences as an Afro-Latina. Can you speak to the awareness and representation between engagement in other sectors of life and what that's like for opera?
Yeah, being Afro-Latina, it's an identity that has always existed. I want to reiterate that Black Latin people have existed since the beginning of the tragically violent mixture of like colonization and settler colonialism, right? And so we've always been around, yet people that identify as Afro-Latino now are really leaning into their full identity and rejecting the inherent anti-Blackness that exists within Latinidad. And we're having very public conversations that are more mainstream now, I think. With things like In the Heights and calling for more accurate representation of Afro-Latinx people. I think that in terms of opera, this is something that doesn't necessarily exist like broadly. There are Afro-Latinx singers within that are opera singers, but is there text? Is there a story that is specifically about Afro-Latinx people? No, which is why I have my project. There's like maybe one thing, like the Cinco Canciones Negras, 5 Black songs, and it's written by a Catalan composer, a Spanish composer from Spain, and it's all Afro-Cuban poetry, but it's all written from the gaze of a white Spanish man. And those are beautiful songs. I sing them all the time, but I would want to hear what an Afro-Latinx composer would have to say about text that reflects them. It's like, what would happen? What would be the depth of that expression, right? And so I think that there's room for that at opera. There's more room for more nuance in our identities to be represented, not just with the people, but with storytelling. I think that it's a little more present in other sectors like TV and even musical theater. But yeah, I'm hoping that changes in the very near future.
Oh, it has to change. That's why we're having this conversation. These things must change. As we look at what it means for Dallas Opera to be presenting, and for the first time in about 2 years, full production, the first thing is Madame Butterfly. So this connection between, I'd like to know what someone who lives that experience has to say about this, or has to say about anything, is very vivid and it's very real. Given the historical context, of course, who was writing what and who the composers were and the librettists were, it was always this outside view of, I'm going to tell the story of someone else, as well as my own story, right? As we have as they had the opportunity to kind of command what stories are told and who gets to tell them. It's still a very real space for us here in the 21st century of what does it mean for this person who does not know to no longer tell someone else's story, or to no longer tell someone else's story without direct influence and without direct attribution to what it means to lean into that community as a guest We have vivid examples of this in opera. We have different, of course, works that kind of stand alone and tend to be the representation of that community. With Madame Butterfly, with Porgy and Bess, with all these things. Dallas Opera is also doing the Pearl Fishers. What does it mean for us to get to a space as artists, as an opera community, as creatives, to say that we have more space for people to tell their own stories? We have more space for more people to tell different stories. It's kind of my larger question that I'm sending out into the world. With that, I'm going to send my next question to Nick. As an artist in operatic and concert spaces, right, and doing both, what do you find has been the most meaningful impact concerning representation, both on stage and behind the stage? You get to see both when it comes for other artists, but then also when it comes to audience members.
Sure. So for me, I'm approaching this, I think, mostly through my lens as a song programmer and a recital programmer. You know, I through my work at CAIC in Chicago and also elsewhere where have the privilege of serving as guest curator. And song actually provides a really wonderful opportunity to explore representation because everything is so, I mean, songs are short. And so you have a great opportunity to get as many identities and people represented in a program as possible, especially when I have the luxury of working with multiple singers. For instance, like I recently was invited to curate a recital for the Maryland Opera program out here in San Francisco. And it was a fantastic opportunity for us to do a giant survey of non-white composers, which was really exciting. But I think the thing that really, another reason beyond it just being, you know, the pieces being short and there's an opportunity to explore a lot of things, is that also song really focuses on shared human experience. And that allows us the opportunity as performers and as presenters to call in as opposed to call out. Not that calling out is not necessary and warranted at times. I mean, it definitely is. And there's a lot of opportunity to call out right now. And there has been historically. But it's a very special, I think, really important opportunity to call in through the art and get people to focus on what is shared, what are the experiences we share as humans? How do we increase compassion? How do we increase empathy? And instead of trying to highlight division, if that makes any sense. It keeps the focus on winning hearts and minds, which I think is really the ultimate goal. And I think the greatest power that art has, opera, song, musical theater, any sort of art. And I'll specifically through song, recently I'll go back to Stranger. I had this really extraordinary experience recently last fall. I was touring Stranger in various places around the country with a string quartet in October. And our last two stops were Boston one night, and then we flew to Phoenix and we performed in Scottsdale, Arizona 36 hours later. And doing a piece that's 20 minutes about immigration policy in the United States in Boston was extraordinarily different than doing it in a place like Scottsdale, Arizona, where you have people like Joe Arpaio, et cetera, you know, serious issues in real time, in real space, in regards to immigration and particularly immigration of marginalized communities. And when I was introducing the piece in Boston, the Boston audience was, you know, nodding their heads like the sort of like white liberal group of people that they were mostly, you know, going, yes, yes, yes. And it felt like a very welcoming audience to this message. In Scottsdale, I heard audible gasps of breath from the audience when I was describing what the piece was about, because people were really bracing themselves to not like it. A, it's new music. B, it's dealing with the subject matter that's very sensitive. And it really informed the performance we gave. The five of us that day really dialed into the humanity of the performance. What was powerful about that piece in particular is that it really speaks to the human experience of immigration. You see the suffering that these people all have gone through, regardless of whether they were Chinese or Jews coming in through Ellis Island or Sicilians coming in through Ellis Island. The experiences were the same. And it told those stories in a way that, you know, focused on how hard it is for us to be separated from our loved ones, how scary it is to move from one place to another, all things that we can totally relate to. And you could feel the energy in the room warm. And I think that that's really the most important thing we can really focus on, at least as performers and people who are choosing to put things up in front of people. I think that's why it's important.
Absolutely. It is a beautiful opportunity for people to connect from human to human, but I appreciate you speaking about the difference in impact based on what was happening in the space and the very realness that comes when audiences are dealing with something in real time. So it's not enough, just like it's not enough to say that, oh, we're artists, we all get along. It's not enough to say, oh, this is just art, just watch it. No, these are human stories. I'm a human being. These are things that people are experiencing. So I appreciate you bringing that perspective into the space as well. And the importance of leaning into, we're trying to tell a story, and as human beings, we may not have the same experiences, but there are common experiences that we have. We know what it's like to hurt. We know what it's like to love, what it's like to laugh, to be excited, to be frustrated, all these beautiful things. We know what it is like. And here's how we tell the story. Who tells the story matters, of course. Who helps tell the story matters. And then who gets to determine the perspective of the storytelling also matters. Suli?
I was just gonna say that it was really moving to hear that, Nick, how just the reality that we live in informed what was going on in the performance. And, you know, I think sometimes in this art form, it's like, it's almost seen as escape, you know, an escape from reality. And there's room for that. And there's room for truth telling. And there's also room, which is my favorite thing, imagining futures and creating realities where the most marginalized can thrive. And it can be a vehicle to show publicly that we could create those futures. They don't have to be in our imaginations.
Wonderful. Oh, go for it, Nick.
I was just going to say thanks. That's really beautiful. I think, speaking to what you both have just said too, it was a reminder that, you know, I know especially for opera houses, it's very easy for us to get focused on ticket sales and, you know, are we getting people in the front door, and, you know, what can sell, and sort of there's the business aspects of it because it is a giant business. It costs a lot of money to make an opera happen. But at the end of the day, we are serving our communities and we're being in dialogue with our communities. And that's part of the point of these performances. I mean, yes, it's to escape. Yes, it's to entertain, but it's also about, as you say, Zuli, envisioning and dreaming for a better reality now and in the future. And I think that's something that can get lost in the shuffle as we all get stressed out about the bottom line.
And then the influence of how do we get to the bottom line, right? And knowing that as we have particular practices, we have particular constructs, oh, it's always been this way. A lot of opera companies are facing this challenge right now, especially in this space of greater awareness of what it means for those who have been silenced, those who have been fighting for the voices to be heard, to have more of a platform. We still see ways in which those structures, those practices still have not met the needs of everyone, which is why conversations like this are so important. What does it mean for representation to be respectful, for it to be meaningful, for it to uplift communities? What does it mean for the power hoarding that has been in place and who gets to tell stories to be removed, to be eradicated? We've said several times in different spaces that opera is a very huge art form. It's a very big art form. It can fit more stories. It can fit more people. It can fit more experiences in what we're doing. But it's important that we have these conversations so that we can be honest about what is working, what is not working, what needs to go, and why. It's okay for it to go bye-bye. I'm gonna ask this next question. I'd like Stephanie, if you will, to kind of respond first. Of course, we're all in this space as we're dealing with the pandemic, but we're also dealing with what people call social unrest. Things have been, things have lacked peace for some communities for a long time. So I do want to acknowledge that this is not a new space of social unrest for some groups and for some identities, particularly people of color. In this, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the Atlanta shootings, we see a lot of companies who are aiming to increase the racial diversity of their staff and casting and audiences. Everybody's aiming to get more people into the space. What should people, first and foremost, and companies consider in this approach and when engaging various audiences and communities?
The first important thing is to distinguish diversity from racial equity. And so that is where I see a lot of companies and organizations in the wake of George Floyd and this racial reckoning, is that their solution is to increase diversity and to increase the numbers of people of color in their space without doing the harder, painful work of acknowledging racial inequity in the world and the country, but more specifically within the walls of their institutions and organizations. And so what you're doing is you're adding more people of color, you're adding diversity, but you're bringing those people into a space that is still harmful to them because you haven't eradicated that inequity and those unjust systems. And so it can be counterproductive because you're continuing to do more harm on more people. And I want to use the Dallas Opera's new production as an example of a response that I think a lot of people did. They want more stories featuring people of color, with this idea of diversity and color blindness, that if we don't see color and we follow the Hamilton casting model and everyone is available for every role versus culturally competent or culturally responsive, color conscious, you lose the nuance and the historic stories and issues that different people face. And so choosing a story like Madame Butterfly in the year following the Stop Asian Hate and the Atlanta shooting, I think in some people's minds, bringing Asian culture to the stage is a way to combat the Asian hate, but in my opinion and what I've seen historically, it can actually exacerbate those stereotypes and that harm. So we're looking at a story that is one of the most powerful examples of Orientalism, seeing Asian culture from a very Eurocentric white lens and using the exoticness of Asia as the plot line, and then zooming in to Asian women and their stereotype as geishas, as submissive China dolls who exist to be the object of desire for white men, which is the exact motivation behind the shootings in Atlanta. A white man put those stereotypes on Asian women and saw them as sexual objects that threatened him and led to their murder. And so we have to be really careful about the stories that we're telling and why, and the context behind it and the historical implications from that. And what is interesting, and I know we're going to talk about this further, is the choice to not cast an Asian woman in the lead role. And in one way, I look to that and think, thank goodness an Asian woman does not have to die by suicide on stage after what we saw last year, but also, is this a story that we need to continue telling? Because again, it has really perpetuated some harmful stereotypes, and we've seen really actual ramifications of that recently.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. And I want to acknowledge and express gratitude in the difficulty, one, in having a conversation, but then the difficulty in facing an entire industry and saying, do we really need to keep doing this? But the very earnest and necessary voice of, do you know what is happening? Do you really get? I appreciate you saying, thank goodness, an Asian woman does not have to go through this on top of the things that are happening. We approach opera from a space of fantasy in a lot of ways, but these are real human beings who are telling these stories. And these stories themselves are not always received from a space of fantasy, especially when there are secondary and tertiary interpretations of actual living experiences. So thank you, one, for asking, right? Why would you do this Dallas Opera? Which a lot of communities ask of their opera companies, why would you do this? The combination of the different influences in this and what it means for this to be part of canon, part of opera repertoire, of course, also allows us in this series, which is why we're having this conversation, to explore what does it mean for us to program things that are meaningful for the community? What does it mean for us to redesign how we tell stories? What does it mean for us as an organization to learn from this experience, to learn what to do, to learn what to change, and to do so respectfully, so that going forward, we're in a space of not why did you program this, but what else are we going to do, right? I'm gonna pass that to Nick to share some of the things that are happening kind of behind the scenes of Dallas Opera, but then also your perspective on this gathering of people into spaces so that we can prove that we are diverse, so that we can prove that we're relative. And that is a practice that we're seeing in a lot of organizations in different spaces. So Nick.
I think when it comes to this idea of being intentional in terms of diversifying a cast, a roster of artists, or a staff roster, I think the first thing that I tend to hear people question is, what about meritocracy? And it's a myth, right? Like, I think the thing that we all have to kind of really keep in mind here is that that is BS, for lack of a better word. It's when you're dealing with such an inequitable playing field, not everybody has the same opportunity to be excellent. And if you're not starting from an equitable place, then not everybody has equal opportunity, and therefore it's not really a meritocracy. And particularly when it comes into casting, it's interesting. I've been a member of, last month I was doing Messiahs, which meant that I was part of a quartet. And I was really excited to be a member of 4 very diverse quartets. And it was interesting to me to notice how many people would make comments like, oh, diversity. And I kept thinking to myself, all of my colleagues are excellent. There's no question about that. Like, why is that even being mentioned? The fact that it's mentioned is an illustration of the inequity of the playing field in which we are playing. And it's just yet one more hurdle that we all have to overcome as we try and share our art form and share our talents and share, these gifts that God gave us with the world. Every single time I get up on stage, that's what's going on in the back of my mind, because I know someone somewhere is saying that. And that's not fair. And I think that is something that people need to interrogate, people who are making decisions about hiring and firing. And in that interrogation of it, I think there's an opportunity to create a real meritocracy in which you're giving everybody an equal chance to be excellent. And it will only lift up an organization or an art form or a cast or any group of things. Those are my first thoughts about it. I know that we're going to touch on the other stuff that Stephanie brought up in a little bit. So I'll say it.
Go in, dive in. It's completely up to you. Truly.
I'm so glad you brought up the myth of meritocracy, because I cannot tell you how many times I've stepped into, and whether it's an audition, a gig, rehearsal, a space where I'm expected to perform flawlessly at all times, there's no wiggle room for me to stumble like other colleagues, because I'm also it's almost as if they're doing me a favor, just like giving me that opportunity. You know, it's like within Black singers, it's like we have to be better than good to just get this much. And I appreciate that you brought up, you know, all the things going on in the back of your head. How am I supposed to create to the fullest of my ability in a space that is so hostile and doesn't give me room to show up as fully myself? How? We still do it. Think about it. We still do it. But how much extra energy, not just physically, emotionally, mentally, it takes to do it. It's not fair. You're absolutely right. It's not fair. I don't get to go into a space and think that, oh, everything is peachy. Everybody knows that my abilities. No. I don't get that benefit of the doubt. You know, I'm sure you don't get that benefit of the doubt. That's always there. And I don't think that the dominant group in opera realizes that. These are the little things that we're constantly dealing with as performers of color all the time. And not just like professionally, but in school. Like it's in everything, right? So the equitable playing field needs to start from the get-go. Accessibility, even before getting into the institutions to learn, you know, making things more affordable, making this business more affordable. There's just so many social inequities going into play that there's just no way that this could be a meritocracy until all those things are addressed.
Right. And when it comes to the process of, you know, making these decisions about who gets the job,
yeah,
you know, that when doing it in this space in which meritocracy is being questioned and, you know, there's a push for increased diversity, increased representation, that is only going to create opportunity to discover what each person's implicit biases are. And we all hold them.
Yes.
And the idea that we don't is also a myth.
yes.
And this opportunity to interrogate those and question why we hold them, and also question how they're informing our vision, our opinions, our choices, is only going to be a good thing, right? It's going to help us see more clearly at the end of the day as we make decisions. And I mean, that's my hope for where we're going.
You know, this is a conversation that has been happening, right? So how is it, like, I'll use myself for it as an example. I walk into an audition and I am seen as a Black woman because I am, but usually, almost always, nobody ever thinks or knows or assumes that I'm Latina, right? So their implicit bias is, oh, Black woman with curly hair, she's an African-American woman, she'd be great. This happened a lot more in Europe than it did here, but she'd be great for Porgy and Bess or Aida. Those are the two things I got asked for all the time, because apparently I couldn't sing anything past those two things, right? And so let's say I get cast in Porgy and Bess, or like, for example, I'm singing a concert where I have to sing Lift Every Voice and Sing this weekend. And people were surprised that I wasn't very familiar with it. I'm not an African-American woman. I'm a Dominican woman, a Black Dominican woman. I didn't grow up listening to that. I grew up listening to merengue, bachata, and, you know, ask me about that. Yeah, you know what I mean? So, so of course, this is something that's not as familiar to me. And so this kind of, so let's say there's like there's something like that's being cast that's for a Latina. I should be cast for that, right? Because I'm Latina, but I'm never considered for that because I don't look Latina, whatever that means. And that's where implicit bias comes in. That's where nuance about ethnicities, identities, cultures needs to come in. And how I identify versus how I'm racialized and identified by casting people are two totally different things a lot of the time. And for a lot of people, I think in opera. And that does play a huge part. And you're absolutely right. These things need to be like explored and like delve deep into and figured out, because how the implicit bias and how you're perceived plays a huge part in what we're seeing, and plays a huge part in what we're seeing on the stage.
Is it okay if I jump in again?
Go for it.
Okay.
The conversation.
No, I feel like this really gets back to also, Suli, the thing you were talking about in terms of this idea that like the arts is a safe space, because of course we all, and Quo was talking about this as well. The arts is a safe space. This is a place where this, you know, neverland utopia where these things don't exist, and it exists in isolation. We hold this ideal that art is for everybody. You know, music is for everybody. Opera is for all. I mean, how many marketing campaigns have we seen opera companies use that exact phrase, opera is for all? And in a way, that makes sense. There's a truth to that, because like I said when I was introducing myself, this is a space where I found community. It's where I felt like I could finally be who I was in a way. I was able to function as a creative, and I found my voice, so to speak, and, you know, therefore found myself. And so, yes, like there is this aspect of art, or there's a truth to this art being for all, but that notion is still a white notion. It's very different for Fritz Kreisler at the end of World War I, walking around as an Austrian famous violinist saying music is for everybody and knows no boundaries, because he's a white guy. If he comes over here to the United States, that experience, he's not marked by anything until his accent comes out speaking. Yeah. It's a very, very different experience. It's a very, very different notion. Mm-hmm. But when you're always perceived as foreign because of these implicit biases that you're talking about, it's a hurdle, and it means that there's a space between the reality and the ideal.
Yes.
And we need to bridge that gap. And the only way we're going to do it is by sitting in this really awkward place where we are intentional about the decisions we make that feel very different and very new.
And in this, it's so rich, right? You've covered and spoken about so many things, the myth of meritocracy, and that the expectation is not the same for everyone when they come into the space, even if the skills are on par, even if the skill set is exemplary. There are additional expectations that are placed on people. So as we as organizations, as opera organizations, dive into this frenzy of we can get more people into the space, we have to be mindful of what we're expecting of those people, because your organization and your environment does not change just because you've added more people. If you do not provide them with the agency, and if you do not yourself do the work to make sure that it is an environment that actually celebrates diversity, and that's diversity in all types of identity and what that means, not just racial and ethnic, gender or ability, religion. We have all these different things that make us who we are. It's important that as we look at opera is for all, if opera is for all, why does it only look this way? Opera can be for all. It can definitely be for all. Opera and its beautiful art form, the arts, definitely for all, but not as it is now. Not as it is now, and not in the ways in which we're presenting it now, which is why there's such a disconnect between organizations and their very good intent and the impact and the engagement and the resonance and the relevance for communities and for artists. That's why we're steady in this space of, I thought that changed. I thought we did better. I thought we did this, but we were coming from it from a space of, well, opera's for everybody. You should like it as is. We're missing that equity piece, that what do you need that is different from everyone else? Different, not bad, different, not good, different as in it exists because we're human beings. What do you need that is different from everyone else? So I appreciate you all in this, I'm snapping, right? In this beautiful opportunity to actually explore this space and what it means for both our artists, for our audiences, and then of course, what it means for staff. This leads me to my next question. We often hear there is not enough. Stephanie, you brought up this beautiful point in Dallas Opera's casting decision. Were we in a world where the color of your skin does not matter, which will not exist? The current cast for the season represents so many different nationalities as well as experiences for the Dallas Opera, which is beautiful. David did a beautiful job. We want to make sure that we're mindful about what it means when we say, oh, but there aren't enough roles. There aren't enough roles for this particular type of person. There aren't enough roles or stories for this particular experience. In this, we call this the lie of scarcity. There's enough, we can make more. The lie of scarcity often pits communities against one another. Particularly, it comes into this pitting against people of color, communities of color, in vying for these roles, which is a dangerous opportunity for us to miss the point in what it means for us to create space. So this is also true when it comes to casting decisions for identity-specific operas, such as what we're dealing with right now. Can you share your thoughts on this? I'd like to hear what everybody thinks about that space.
Well, one thing I'm going to jump in and just say that one thing I think, in a way, there is a myth to scarcity as well, right? We can create more opportunity, but also there's a truth to it. Mm-hmm. And I think there's definitely, specifically for singers who are coming from marginalized groups, there is definitely a truth to scarcity. Like, for instance, the Dallas Opera, as long as it's only going to do so many productions a year, has only so many opportunities to offer singers. And when you pick an identity-specific opera, like, say, Madame Butterfly, that starts to open this door into this myth of scarcity, because as singers of color, as Asian singers, for instance, we have any singer of color has so many more hurdles to overcome when in order to be considered for being cast in a role like Susanna in Marriage of Figaro or Rodolfo in La Boheme. And most of the standard operatic canon falls into this category, where it's telling Eurocentric white stories from a white gaze, populated with white characters. It's traditionally seen as white characters. And while we are beginning to kind of open the door and open our minds this way in the operatic community, we're not there yet. And so Asian singers, when they see the Butterfly is being done, we logically think this is our small slice of the pie.
Right.
And it's not necessarily an unreasonable thing to be thinking.
Right.
And I think it's so important to be conscious of that when going about making casting decisions in an identity-specific opera, if that makes any sense. It's, if you're going to do Porgy and Bess, and you're going to cast it with an entirely non-Black cast, that's a very, very different dynamic than if you're going to do Marriage of Figaro and cast it with a non-white cast with Hamilton casting. It's not an equal two-way street.
Right. In addition to the restrictions placed on casting, right? Specifically for Porgy and Bess, because of people were not letting people on stage. You could not be on stage, and you definitely could not be on stage next to this white singer. So it's this opportunity for us to see how this is so prevalent in so many communities that it can no longer be ignored, right? We're beyond the question of whom should we cast so much as why is there not more, right? Why is there not more opportunities? And why are we not paying attention to whom we're casting for these very specific roles and these specific experiences, knowing that there's impact in different ways? Stephanie, again, shared, I'm glad an Asian woman doesn't have to do this, but what does that mean if we're intentionally saying, okay, we're going to cast this person because yes, they have the goods. We always want to look at, yes, they can sing this role and do it beautifully. And this is not a question, of course, we can answer in this discussion. It's a field-wide question and conversation that we have to continue. It is the space of when do we be honest about where we're choosing to intentionally cast someone and intentionally break these molds or intentionally make sure this community is represented. And then when do we be honest about when we're just using something for convenience to say, oh, well, here.
Yeah.
Or to say, well, most of the roles are white, so of course, most people on stage will be white. As we look at that, that microcosm of a larger issue, I also want us to be mindful that these culture-specific operas are such because the default is white, right? As we look at that. And that doesn't make it any less true, but it does add framing. They are culture specific. This is the way that this community looks. That's mine. This opera, okay, I'm bound to get this gig because I get pigeonholed into kind of these roles. So I'm bound to get these gigs if I'm going to get something else. And the ways that we branch out of limiting artists, the ways that we branch out of limiting artists, not just with the roles, but the ways that we engage with artists and the expectations that we placed on artists. Okay, go for it, Sudi.
Yeah, I was just gonna say what this kind of like created scarcity just speaks to, like, in my mind, like two things. Like, our white colleagues can be imagined to be anything, and people from marginalized identities do not have that luxury. So it's the double standard there. And then the tokenization of people of marginalized identities to fill like the quota of diversity, if that makes sense. Because it'll be the same person or the same few people doing this, you know, being able to like go past the culturally specific roles, but it'll be like the select few that are chosen by who, right, to do those specific things. So yeah, it's definitely a fabricated scarcity, because it's like I said before, I used to only get asked Aida for your best. Why can't I sing anything else? And then my white colleague gets asked for Aida, not Porgy and Bess, but Aida, and then all the other things that I also sing, but I never get it. You know, so it's like, why? What is it about my Black skin that doesn't let you like suspend reality for a second and let me live in this opera world where I'm being something other, that I'm a Black woman in that space? Why can't I be a Black woman in that space in another role that isn't where the main plot point is my Blackness?
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
just, it's,
well, the main point isn't just that. Yeah.
Yeah.
As a representative and as leadership council for Black Opera Alliance, for those who do not know, Black Opera Alliance is an organization that very much helped push the opera industry into a space of great accountability. Work was already being done, of course, but in BOA's approach with the Pledge for Racial Equity, a lot of organizations had the opportunity to see and to learn what can be done to change, and then to sign a pledge. General directors, leaders had an opportunity to sign a pledge to say, yeah, I pledge to doing these things, or I pledge to doing something like these things. I pledge to working with you and the rest of the opera field so that there's greater racial equity in the opera field. The particular focus, of course, was for Black artists, but we know that that extends to all spaces because we have enough room to do more things. Suli, can you share whether or not there have been any changes, right? Just to give an update, have there been any changes that you can tell us about, or any changes that you've noticed, or any challenges in particular that you want the opera field to be mindful of?
I think that there's definitely been changes. There's definitely companies that are really on board, you know, about these changes, that are really doing the work internally and doing, not just like placing people of color in the organization and not changing like the landscape or changing the space, but there are organizations that are really trying to change the culture, that really doing that examination of making the space also more equitable. I there's also something that, you know, it's constant work. And I think sometimes it's easy to be like, okay, I signed this thing, we're good, and everything's cool. No, espérate. I'm sorry. No, wait. This is constant work. This is constant examination, because it's just so, you know, I don't know if I could say white supremacy. White supremacy is so pervasive. It's in every nook and cranny of everything that we do. It really is. And so it's really easy for things to go by the wayside that might be like, you might not even know, but it's just constant work. So yes, we're so happy when people sign the pledge, and we're so happy to remind them this is constant work. In terms of like what the focus is right now, besides making sure that, you know, organizations are, we get more green card organizations going, we're basically focusing and polling our community, engaging what would be the best support for Black people in opera at this point, and placing the majority of the focus there on what the community needs right now. And this includes collaborating with the green card companies and making sure that the community is heard in order to make the opera sphere more equitable.
I'm actually going to kick it over to Stephanie, because Dallas Truth, Racial and Transformation does beautiful work here in Dallas with the Racial Equity Now cohort, in which organizations go through this very meaningful, very intensive time, a cohort, to learning about racial equity, to learning about the history of Dallas, and then to being able to apply those same concepts and changes for their own organization. Stephanie, can you share some of the challenges that you notice with organizations, and then some tips as our opera companies are listening? What can they be mindful of in this desire and this good intention to do better?
I want to hold that word intention and repeat something you talked about earlier, where intent and impact are very different things. And even the most well-intentioned individual, organization, company can still have a harmful impact. And so we need to do a better job at not only foreseeing what the potential impact is, but listening and receiving feedback when we have been harmful to somebody, and really acknowledging and healing from that, which again is an important part of our framework. One of the most challenging things I've seen, and I think it goes back to this idea that 2020 was sort of a reckoning for people, is that a lot of these policy changes or statements were very reactionary and based on what was happening in current events. And whenever we see progress like this, when we saw it in the civil rights movement, we saw it, you know, after integration of schools, it's followed by a very serious backlash. And so I think the challenge now in 2022, after 2020 and the response and the wave of anti-CRT, anti-history, anti-diversity that came from that, is that this work requires not only a commitment to the constants of it, but a moral fortitude and courageousness in sticking to that, even when faced with opposition, even when it's not trending anymore, when it's not, you know, to do the right thing because it's the right thing, and not because other people are, not because the times are sort of pointing towards that. And so with organizations that have gone through our cohort, what has been really, I think, beautiful for me to watch, Style Summer Musicals is a great example of another arts organization in the city who had to do a lot of uncomfortable internal work. And Ko, you knew that because you were their coach. And for them to go from those really hard conversations after the assessment, after listening to the harm that had been done by the organization and was, you know, the impact that they made a public commitment, put it on their website for everyone to see, and have stuck by that, have integrated racial equity into their education programming, have written in their letter in the program for Hamilton about the need for truth and healing and transformation and naming systemic racism, even after everything that happened in the school boards and in the school districts locally, where people were starting to get really critical of anyone who mentioned racism or diversity. They stuck to it and they continue to do that. And I think that's what we need, is we need that courage.
Thank you for sharing that. In this, the work is not easy. This is not about convenience. It is not going to be convenient to change the ways in which our organizations do our work. It is not going to be convenient to go against a culture that says do not talk about it, or a culture that says there's no problem. The moral fortitude, the conviction, but as well as a space for support and community is what actually drives us to be able to move forward, so that we can consider different ways of doing things, so that we can consider how we cast. I want to first ask Nick, in the Asian Opera Alliance's call for change, you all are very explicit about being inspired by the work of Black Opera Alliance, and then as well as providing some very real examples of some of the challenges that Asian artists face in the opera field. The first call for change is simply cast us. Can you elaborate for everybody in the space? And of course, y'all can go read it. Please do read it, that as well as the pledge. Can you speak to the power and the nuance of cast us?
Sure. The response to it has been interesting. It's been very interesting, actually. It's been a lot of defensiveness. In some instances. Obviously there have been the initial like, oh, we support you. But when it comes to that particular question, at that particular part of the call, we've really received a mixed response. We've heard stuff like, but there are so many Asian singers, what are you talking about? And that doesn't really answer the question and also indicates a blindness to the issue. It's twofold. It is the kind of casting in terms of being pigeonholed into roles like Butterfly, but it is also as simple as cast us. We are an extraordinarily underrepresented group in the opera world as singers on stages. If you look at the rosters around the country or the continent in North America, we occupy a very, very small percentage, much less actually than our Black and African American colleagues. So it was twofold. And there's been defensiveness about that, because on the one hand, you get people saying, oh, but we do cast you when we do Butterfly or when we do Ping Pang Pong and Turandot or whatnot. And some of that defensiveness has also been, look, our casting is diverse. And then they hand us a roster of artists and there's still not one Asian or Asian American person on there. Instead, people seem to have this idea that diversity is a white-black issue and not necessarily something that involves a rainbow and a full spectrum of color. Along with that, we've had a lot of companies also ask us, how can we do better? And I think how we can do better is the things that I was just mentioning. It's being aware that we are pigeonholed really quickly. It's very difficult to see us as anything but Asian. The idea of the nuance of an Asian American, this idea that we with Asian faces and Asian last names can be Americans or British or whomever, because we've been in these communities for centuries, just ignored. That's been part of the call, is to see us as full humans and as members of your community so that we can be on your stages.
And as we lean into imagination, what does it mean to see some of our kind of staple characters as members of our communities? all of the members of our communities, right? It is not a matter of, oh, Nick is no longer Asian, and because he's not Asian, now he can play this role. I will take it away, and I do not see it as I see it, and he's doing a beautiful job in this role. I see Suli, and she's doing a beautiful job in this role. I see Stephanie, she's doing a beautiful job in this role. So this is not a call to erase identities. It is a call to say, reimagine how you see some of these characters. It is a call to say, we can create more characters, right? And we will. There's a call to say, be intentional about casting, but then also be mindful of the impact that it has on your communities, because some of these things are real time for a lot of our communities. As we come to a close, I want to acknowledge that all three of these amazing organizations in space that are represented in space are represented by amazing people. And the truth telling that happens in each of your organizations is about, this is the truth. Do you have any final truths to share with everyone for this conversation? Of course, as we continue our conversations going forward, any final truths? And what would you like for organizations to truly consider, for opera companies to truly consider when it comes to representation, when it comes to storytelling? I am going to kick it to Suli, then we'll go Stephanie and then Nick.
I'm sitting here thinking about the most succinct way of saying what I want to say, you know.
Let's start with truths. What are the truths? What is it?
I think touching on some of the things we've talked about today, having more people from marginalized groups in a cast together it elevates what you're doing much more than you think. And that's something that needs to be challenged. We elevate. Because you want to bring more booties to the seats, cast things in a way that reflects the community you're trying to serve. Because the reality of life is we all exist in real life, and we all exist in opera too. It's just we need to be taking up this space. The other thing that I was going to say is, come back to me. I'll bring up the second one. I got taken away.
Thank you for that, Zoe. Oh, go for it.
I was just gonna kind of continue on that thought that racism harms everyone. It robs us all of our potential and our greatness. And I think what is so beautiful about art is also what is so painful, is that it has the potential to really transform, and as Nick said, to open hearts and minds. And for art and for art organizations and companies to not be doing it right, it feels even more harmful, because we really should be better and we have the potential. I want to kind of go back to that model of scarcity, because I think this is a truth that needs to be acknowledged. Minority is not factual anymore. People of color, we are the global majority, and we have the power and we have the numbers, and the divisiveness and the pitting of communities of color against each other is strategic. It has been done historically to keep people disenfranchised, to keep us from banding together, learning from each other. And for Nick's alliance to be inspired by the Black Opera Alliance shows the power that we have when we learn from each other and we share that power. And we have to start questioning things beyond the tokenization and the idea of scarcity. And who is casting this? Who is the director? I think historically an important model minority event was the LA riots. And I think about while Black and Korean communities were fighting and rioting, the police were protecting the rich white suburbs. And that, I think, is a metaphor for a lot of things that are happening, and especially in the arts when it comes to casting. We are hurting ourselves. We are keeping ourselves from that greatness, and who is benefiting from that? And we have to tell that ugly truth. There are white board members, white patrons, white directors, white people in power that are benefiting while we're scrambling for these, these crumbs.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. There's such truth to that, and there's such power in the truth telling of who actually benefits or seems to benefit on the surface, because we're mindful that, again, racism harms everyone. So those same individuals in the suburbs, white individuals who were being protected, were also being isolated from being able to help solve the very things that caused the riots. These same board members, these same individuals who are holding on to the idea of this is what this role is supposed to look like, is also being separated from the opportunity of engaging with amazing artists, of being able to expand imaginations, but then also to expand engagement and what it means to see people as people telling stories about people. So thank you for that. I just wanted to, that was powerful, of course. And of course, Nick, can you share with us, what is the truth, right, you'd like to share? And then what would you like for our opera companies to consider when it comes to representation?
I'm actually going to share a quote from one of my colleagues. This is something that we've been obviously discussing a lot as we organize ourselves at the Asian Opera Alliance. And someone had a really great insight about this, and I'd like to use her words. And she basically pointed out, she said, we live, this again gets to speaking about truth. We live in a multiracial society. Our stages should reflect our communities, and representation matters. If you only see certain races as caricatures on stage, the people from that demographic feel unsafe in our workplace. We have to make seeing a Black Romeo and an Asian Juliet the norm, even if we have to sit in this really uncomfortable space as we do that. And that's going to require intention and intentionality. And another one of my colleagues also just said, pointed out, because of this multiracial society in which we live, there should be nothing about us without us. The art we create should not simply be in service to the white gaze, but in service to our lived experiences, our communities, and our authentic stories.
Yeah.
I thought those were wise words from my colleagues, and I'm going to let them speak for me instead in this instance.
Of course, thank you. I'm going to pass it back over to Suli to finish her thought, and then as we wrap up our conversation.
Nick, those were absolutely spot on and really beautiful to hear. And to kind of continue in that vein, we are 3D human people that have all kinds of experience. I would love to see more things written that don't have to do with Black trauma. That would be great.
That's a whole conversation.
That's a whole conversation, but guess what? Like, you know, I fall in love. I'm happy. I'm
funny.
I'm funny. Haha. Like there's so much more than just these narratives, right? And the other thing is that I wanted to like just add to all this as a truth. Whether you're, you know, white or whatever walk of life, whatever race, whatever ethnicity, we're not impervious to the systems we live in. We all internalize them.
Right.
So we all, as Stephanie said, we all have implicit bias. You might think that you don't because you're the wokest of the woke, but you do. And that goes for people of minoritized groups, that goes for Latinos, that goes for everyone. We all have biases that are informed by the systems that we live in. We do internalize things that work against us sometimes. So it's important to really take that into consideration if you're a person making decisions that affect how community is represented.
Thank you all for lending your time and your energy for this conversation that's kicking off the Dallas Opera's TDO Connections series. This is a conversation where we want to be real about the things that we're facing. We want to give light to the things that our communities are experiencing. But then we also want to put out a call and an invitation to the rest of the opera field to share in this conversation about what does it mean to be represented in opera? What has it meant? What does it mean now? And what can it mean going forward? I am ever so grateful to each of you for your amazing work, as well as amazing work of your organizations. And my final notes, of course, to our audiences, and then to those who are participating in any types of productions that are taking place. Once again, as opera tells the story of the human experience, as opera is a gateway, as a method for us to share and to communicate with one another, for us to use our imaginations. Let us find the truth in knowing that our communities should be represented. Our communities should be present, because otherwise we rob ourselves of the opportunity to actually connect and to experience amazing artistry on all scales, but then to experience amazing moments, which is the real art that we're wanting to do. So with that, thank you. We look forward to any feedback, any comments. We look forward to hearing how you all are taking these conversations with you to other spaces. And have a good one.